Hey guys, welcome back. In this video, we are going to be building a dynamic form in React. So we'll build a form that will enable a user to add different items. So in our current scenario, we let the user enter their platform. Let's say they're on Facebook and then their username on Facebook. So they can add different inputs as you can see. So here, let's say they add a Twitter and then they can add the username on Twitter. So we'll have validation so that the user doesn't have to submit a form that's incomplete or add more fields than they can fill. So here we can go ahead and enter a username. Similarly, we can remove some, we can handle the on change, and every time you see something changes in the form, it's updated here. I have a small representation of the form state, and then you see that when the form is invalid, then we have the error showing, and every time the user meets a validation criteria, we take the error away, and then we let the user go ahead and submit the form only when everything is valid. So if I remove this, you see the submit goes. If we add it, then we can go ahead and submit it. All right, so it's going to be interesting. Let's go ahead and build this form right here. All right, so I'm imagining you're following along to build a feature in your project. But if you're starting out new for the purposes of the tutorial, then you can create a new project by running npx create react app. Then you give the app name. And then the only thing I've changed here is I've added the Bootstrap CDN for the CSS to make sure that it's faster when we are coding it. And then I just have a starter code here that basically has a container which kind of puts everything in the middle, and then just these two links. All right, so we start from here. The first thing we're going to need to do is set up a form that's going to hold our inputs and everything in there. All right, so here I'm going to have a form. So in the form, of course, we are going to need to have our input fields, but those input fields are going to be dynamic, meaning we are going to need a way to save them in state. So I'm going to import useState here. So import useState. So this will help us to manage our component state in our functional component. So to use useState, we basically call it with an initial value that we would want to be contained in our form. So our form is going to start out as empty, and since it's going to hold multiple inputs, it's wise to use an array here. So it's going to start out as an empty array. So when you call useState like this, it gives us two things. So now we can destructure those two things out. One is going to be basically the state itself, and another one is going to be the function to update that state. All right, so what we're doing here is we are getting out the form state and then the function to update that state. This is technically called an updater function, and basically every time we want to change what is here, we use this to change it. All right, so now that we have this here in the form, we are going to be mapping out the input fields in here. All right, so before we go there, I want to have a button that you can use to add an input or the first input, because at this current rate we have nothing, so we want to be able to show anything. So I'm going to come in the form and then I'm going to add a button. This button is going to have a text of add a link, and then I'm going to give it some Bootstrap classes to make it look better. So, all right, so once we save that, now we go back here, you see that we have a button saying add a link. So we're going to need to add a link, meaning we are going to handle the event of a user clicking the button. So I'm going to have an onClick here. So the onClick is going to call a function called handle add link. All right, so we're going to come over here, and then what you can do here is create this function. So it's going to be just a function here. So I'm going to create another function here. So what's going to do is we're going to construct basically an initial state of each form input and then insert it in our form using the set form. So basically our input state will be an object. So I'm going to declare it here. So I'm going to call it input state. So it's going to be an object. It's going to start out to have a platform. So the platform is going to be empty by default. Then we're going to have the username. The username is going to also be empty by default. So once we have this, we need to insert them inside our form. So how do we do that? We do that by using the updater function. So we call set form. So when you call set form, it's going to be giving us the previous state. So basically we can get the previous state like this, previous, and then we return a new state. So we're going to be returning an array. Since it's an array, we want to add to it. So we want to keep everything in there, because if you have the first or the second input and we're adding the third, we don't want to be replacing everything. So we want to get everything in there. So we're going to spread prev, and then we are going to be adding there, we are going to be concatenating there our new input. So now we can put input state there. All right, So now that we have a way to add some things to our form, now we can basically display our input fields, since we can add to the form like we've seen. All right, so what we're going to do here before the button, we are going to be mapping through everything in the form. Since it's an array, we can map over it. So I'm going to use this here, then we can use form.map. So when we map, we get the item, we get each item and the index it's at. So I'm going to do this right here, then we get the index, and then we can return something. So we're going to be returning a row. So with Bootstrap, we can create a div and give it a class of row. And then we're going to be giving it a key because we want React to know how to update our form state correctly. So I'm going to be using these backticks here. And then for the key, I'm going to put item, then I'm going to use the index here. So we can do this with the 4 and then the index. All right, so in here, now we can define our form fields. So I'm going to define a call because I want them to be distributed. So div class equals call. All right, so in here we can have an input. So input type equals text. So we're going to have a class name because we want it to look good. So we're going to use the Bootstrap helper classes. So for the class name, we're going to be giving them form control, and then we need to give it a name. For the name, we're going to call it platform, and then we need to give it a placeholder because the user needs to see what's going on there. So placeholder will also be platform. So we also need to manage the value and then the onChange. So this is going to be a controlled input, meaning we need to specify a value here. So the value is going to be directly controlled by the onChange we specify here. So you can specify the onChange, and then over here I'm going to create an onChange function. Because you're going to be having different inputs, we need to know which one to change. So before we call the onChange, we are going to be calling it with the index. So over here we can call onChange, and then we give it the index. So since we have the index here, we can pass it, and then let's also pass the event because we are going to need to pick a value from the event. All right, so over here we can pick the index and the event in that order. So in here, we need to first prevent default so we can handle our onChange properly. So let's prevent default here. And then what we want to do, this should be event. And then what we want to do here is we want to basically find the current input we are changing here and then change the values at that input. So for us to do that, we are going to call setForm. So when you call setForm, it gives us the previous values. So in the previous values, we are going to map over them and find the one that has this index. So we can do prev.map. So when we map, we basically, like map gives us the item and also the index. So we can get those two. I'm going to use I here because we have our index already in the scope. So over here in this body, we can check if this index here is not equal to the index that we are passing in. So we check that. So if this matches, that will mean that the current item at this index is not the one we are dealing with, because the one we are dealing with will match the equal. So here we can just return that item unchanged. But so if it's the current item, then we want to reach out to it and change the platform and then the username values. So the way we do that is here. You already know we are going to return. So we're going to return an object. So we want to keep everything that is already on this item, because if we are changing the username, we don't want to override what's already stored in the platform if the user had provided that. So we're going to keep that. And then over here, so I'm going to use this syntax here because we are dealing with dynamic keys. So every time we pass the event, we can know the name of that input field that is being passed in the event. So we can check event.target.name. Okay, so then we set that one to event.target.value. All right, so what does this mean? So what this means is every time the onChange gets called, we pass the E. So with the E, we can get the name. So in this case, the name will be platform, but if we have the username, the name will be username. So here, when we say set form to this is going to be representing the username or the platform. Whatever input field the user is changing that's calling this onChange will be the one to swap here. And then the input, the e-target value, which should be event actually, will represent the current value of that input. All right, so Looking good. So now let's set the value in the input field. So I'm gonna come over here, and since we update this to contain the value here or the value here, depending on what the user is changing, then we can access the current value by doing .platform on our item here in the map. So here, this is gonna be item dot platform. All right, so this should be E. Let me pass it in here and then make sure it gets sent up there. Then we need to do another call. So I'm gonna copy this, then duplicate it. So this is gonna be username, and the only thing you're gonna change here will be username here. All right, so once we save that, let's go back to the browser. If we come over here and click add, you will see that our input shows there and then goes away. And the reason for that is here in the add field, we also need to be able to prevent default. So when we do that, we can come and add, and you can see that the input stays. We can add another one, looking good. So let's go ahead and add some margins on the top of each, and then also add a button to remove each of these. So I'm gonna come over here where we have the row, and then I'm gonna add a class of empty3, and then still in the same row, before we close the row, I'm going to add a button. That button is gonna be used to actually remove this field we are at. So over here, I'm gonna add a button. So button, I'm gonna add an X here. The user knows it's like a remove or a cancel. So this button is gonna have a class. So this one is gonna be btn, let me call it warning, and then let's give it the on click. So the on click will call a function. So for us to be able to know which one to remove, we need to know the index. So here I'm gonna have a function that returns our function we're gonna call. So we'll call the function. So I'm gonna call it handle remove field, and then we'll be passing it the current index. So pass the index there. All right, so let's create this function here. So I'm gonna come down here, then I will create this. This will be taking in the index, and then we will be changing our form inputs to remove the one at this index. So how do we do that? All right, so now that we've already seen that we need to be passing the event and preventing default, we can do event.prevent default. We need to make sure we are passing it down here. So I'm gonna come over here and pass it, and we get it here on the on click. So if it's passed, we get it, and now everything is good to go. And now we can handle our removal of the field. So first off, we need to look at all the fields we have in a form, then find the one at this very index, and then remove it. So to do that, now we are going to be calling setForm here. So when you call setForm, as you already know, it gives us the previous values. So when you get the previous values, so we basically want to be returning all the previous values without the one at this index included. So we do prev, you can call filter. So when you call filter filters each item and then can give us the index. So I'm going to, so since this can get this as parameters, and then we are going to be, so with the filter, we are going to be returning every other item except the one at this index. So we return the items that are not at this index. So that will be prev, then the index. So the index will be the one here. So actually I'm going to remove this one because we are not actually using it, and then save. So when we save, basically what this is doing is it's getting all the previous items, meaning the previous input fields, and then it's returning every other input field that is not equal to this one. All right, so let's go back to the browser. If we click add a link, we get some links added. Click another one, and then if we click remove, you can see that we remove them. All right, looking good. So let's test the on change. So I'm gonna come over here and add a way to basically view the form. So I'm going to do a json.stringify. Then I'm going to be doing the form here. So if we come back here, you see it's empty by default. If we click add, you see that some values are added. But if we try to change, you see that things go away. Alright, so you will notice that we are not able to get the name from the target. And that's because React is actually reusing our events and we are not able to get the target here. So what you can do here, we are going to do event.persist. So the React event is actually reused. So when we are doing things like on change, sometimes we are going to we are not going to be able to get the target by default. So when we do persist, that's going to make it possible for us to get the target. So if we come back here, try to enter something, you notice that we get another error, but this one is actually different. This one is for the map, and that's because here when we do set form, we need to be returning an array, but what we are doing here is we are returning an object. So what you can do is you can add a return statement, a return keyword here. So this is going to return what the map will return, which will be an array, as map returns an array. Alright, so otherwise you would eliminate the return and then just return from the arrow function. It will be equally okay. So if we come over here, click add, try to enter something, you see that the values are persisted, but there's an issue, it's also being persisted in the second one. So if we come here, let's see what you're doing. And that's because here we are doing vari.platform, which should be vari.username. So if we try it again, you will see that everything is working good. So I'm going to add a margin top here on the button to add. So here we can do an empty2. So if we come back, you will see that everything is now good. We can remove, we can add. Let's remove this one. You see everything is fine. All right, so let's now see how we can handle errors. So for us to be able to handle errors, we need a way to at least save the errors in the state so that we can show them to the user when we get them. So what we're going to do is here, when we create a form state, so that is when we add right here, we're also going to set up an errors key. So these errors, it's going to have basically the errors for these two. So we're going to bring them in here like this, and they're going to start out as null. So the one for the platform is going to be null, and the one for the username is going to be null. So here in the input form, Bootstrap provides us with a handy method for us to highlight the forms when they are invalid, the input fields when they are invalid. So here, before we apply a class name, we are going to check if actually this field has errors. So we check that by doing item. So this is going to be item.errors. Then we're going to check the ones for the platform. So initially they are going to be null, meaning that when they are null, then we can use our normal class. So we can show this class. Then otherwise we'll be showing a different class. So still it's going to be the form control, but we are also going to add another one called is invalid. So is dash invalid. So when we are working with forms like this is going to be able to highlight the field as red, but we also want to be able to show the error. So I'm going to come over here and add another way to add somewhere to show the errors. So I'm going to have a div here. It's going to have a class of invalid feedback. So here we can actually check if the platform has errors before we even show this. So I'm going to nest this one in a check. So only when the platform has errors, then we can show something like, we can actually show the error here. We don't want to hard code it because we're going to be setting it in the state. So we can just show it like this. All right. So let's do the same thing on the second one. So let's do this. So I'm going to copy this and also come on the second input and also bring it in. But the check this time is going to be for the username. So let's have that one in. And then let's do the same class syntax for the username. So if we come over here and do that, you see that every time this should be username. So if we have a username error, then we will be applying a class. So I just noticed that this should be inside, because if we have an error, then we want to apply this style. And if we don't have an error, then we can just skip the normal form control. So let's do the same thing up here. Don't want to mess it up. Let's come over here, bring it in. All right, so looking good. So how do we set the errors? That means that every time a user is trying to add a new field, we want to first validate the previous fields. So I'm going to come over here and wrap this in an if statement. So I'm going to do something like previous is valid. So if that returns a true, then we are going to be setting the form like that. So I'm going to copy this, bring it in here. And then let's create previous is valid up here. So const prev is valid. It's going to be a function. So first off, it's going to be valid when the form is empty. So we can check if the length of the form here, so if form.length equals 0, then we return true. All right, so this should be 3 equal signs. If it's not 0, then we want to check if there is an empty field in the previous ones. So how do we check that? I'm going to set up here a constant called sum empty, or sum are empty. So this one is going to be looking out at is going to be looking out at all the fields we have, then checking if, and this is going to be checking if any of the usernames or the platforms is empty. So here we can return form, we can call sum. So sum returns true or false depending on what the expression returns. So here we can return for so it gives us the item just like any other, these other higher order functions do. So here we can do item.username equals empty, or item.platform equals empty. Alright, so if any of this is empty, it's going to return true. So if it returns true, then here we can just return it. So return sum empty. Alright, so if you think of it here, how we are wrapping this, so we are saying if some of them are empty, we return that they are empty. So here in our check, if it checks the previous one is valid, meaning that now for this to be valid, then this has to be false. So we are going to return the reverse of this. So if we come over here and click add link, you see that the link is added properly, but when you try to add the second one, it's not added. So now what we're going to do is be able to show the user the errors so that they need to first fill this before they can add another one. So here, before we return sum empty, we are going to do a check here. So we are going to check if some are empty. Then we are going to find out which of those ones are empty. So we are going to be mapping through we are going to be mapping over the form. So form.map. And then, as we know, we get the item and the index. So let's first get everything else in the form. So const, I'm going to call them all prev. So this is going to be getting everything in the form. So I'm going to spread over the array and create a new array called all prev. It's basically the same thing, but we're going to be using all prev differently. So we're going to check if the item at this index, if the platform at the item at this index is empty. So we can do that by checking. So if form at this index, so we can check at this index, then we want to check platform, then we want to check if it's empty. Right, so if it's empty, then we want to now set an error on our all prev. So we can do all prev, then index. Then we want to be reaching out for the errors because each item has the errors key that we set when we are creating the item or the field. So we want to reach out for the errors, then we want to go to platform, and then we want to set this one to a value. So we're going to set this one to platform is required. Right, so let's do the same thing for the username. So I'm going to copy and duplicate this here. This is going to be the username. Let's rename this to be username. And then we want to be updating the whole global form because the array is in the whole global form. So we can do set form, and then we pass our new state. All right, so notice that we don't override everything because the form is actually spreading the previous form, meaning that we only change what has changed over here. All right, so if we come over here and try to add a field, try to add another one, you see that the errors are shown and the classes are also applied. All right, so now the problem comes when we are trying to enter another one. This means that every time we enter, the value changes, meaning the validation should change. So for us to be able to update the validation when the user is typing, we are going to go on the onChange. So we're going to come over here. So every time we handle the onChange, we are going to check if the length of the value in the current field we are changing for is greater than 0. And then we are going to reset the error state to null. Or else we are going to keep it the way it is. All right, so the way we do that here is we need to bring in errors. And then over here inside, then we can get the errors that are there. So we get the errors that are there from item.errors. Because when the username input has errors and a user is changing for the platform, we don't want to clear out the errors for the username. So we'll bring up everything and then we will change only the error for the current input field. So the way we do that is we're going to still use this other dynamic key syntax. And then for the value, we are going to be checking event target value. We're going to check the value of the event target value here. Then we call .length on it. Then we check if it's greater than 0. So if it's greater than 0, we return a null. Otherwise, we basically keep the errors that are there. So the errors that are there, we basically know it will be somewhat of this. It will be the name, something like platform or username. Then we say something like is required. But you can change this to meet your requirement. For us, we are just handling basically the bare minimum. All right, so this is gonna handle it. Now for us, let's test it out. So if we come over here, add one, try to add, and then click enter, you see this one has errors. So if we try to enter, you see that the errors go away, which is what we want. All right, so looking good. So now everything is good. We can add input fields. We can't add another one before this one is filled. So I guess this is gonna do it for the tutorial. If you wanted to like submit the form, you can easily filter out the key for the errors and be able to handle your basically clean up and submit your form the way you want. So thanks guys for watching. I know this was a bit long, but thanks for keeping around. If you enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching. Bye.